Greetings and welcome. We are in 303 and we now turn back to our ACT grammar prep lectures. We are in lecture number 5 over verbs. But as promised in earlier lectures, we'll start with a little fun first and then get into our discussion about verbs. I say fun. I mean, I'm trying to at least point out that there's any number of ways to think about this ACT-SAT project. For example, watch this one. We talked earlier about both an ACT and an SAT and what those letters kind of represent. Now let's ask this question because we promised it earlier. What is the primary differences between the SAT and the ACT? Which test is harder? Which test is better? These are interesting questions that I'm going to only touch for a few seconds here, but at least maybe pique your interest. The structure of the test actually is quite similar. Both tests, for example, have a reading and a language usage portion. That's obviously what we're prepping for here. They have a math section. The SAT does not have, however, a science portion that the ACT will have. Both tests will also offer some kind of optional essay if you want to write it, right? And most of the time now students will be writing that. Both tests take around 3 hours longer if you have to write the essay, obviously. Both tests will review math materials from arithmetic through Algebra 1 and 2, geometry as well as trig. The SAT includes some data analysis stuff. In terms of scoring, though, there is a little bit of a difference in the understanding here. I'll just mention it because sometimes students will want to know about the differences in scoring. On the SAT, you have a score that runs from about 400 to 1600, and the ACT scoring is, of course, between 1 and a 36, right? You've got to write a 25 to be able to, at the moment anyway, receive your Hathaway top-tier scholarship, right? I'll let you do your own research to see how people love to argue online about which test is harder, which test is better. You know, in the end, the only thing that matters is you're prepared for either test, right? And that's why, obviously, we're studying here. So let's go ahead and get to work with verbs, right? Before we turn to verbs, though, let's review a few ideas. We've looked at the subject, noun, pronoun part of a sentence. That is to say in English grammar, just to remind, you have your two parts of a sentence, right? You have something, a noun, a subject, a pronoun. Doing something, that's the verb, the predicate component, and that's what we turn to now, okay? As we said in earlier lectures, there's really two parts we'll want to focus on when we study grammar rules. One of these, of course, is the what is it part. That is to say, what is the rule that we're studying? And then the second is, how does the rule work, right? And this is the more important part of your study for ACT, in my estimation. Again, let me just emphasize this. Don't worry about the rules and the way they are, okay? Or whether you think they're silly. They probably are. The chances are they probably are silly. It doesn't matter. What really matters is you learn the rules so you can write a higher ACT score. And that's kind of how I'll approach it with you now, all right? Work through this lecture suggestion. Work through this lecture the way you did lecture 4. Slow, intentional, focused. Don't try and digest this entire lecture in one sitting. I think that's a pretty dumb thing to do. You can always go back, study the information again, especially before you get ready to take the actual ACT. I do recommend that the previous lecture and this lecture are 2 lectures that you would listen to or study, again, right before you take your ACT. All right, let's turn to verbs. Of course, these are words that name actions, right? Some say verbs are the most important part of speech, but you know, really, I think that's kind of silly, right? Since you have to do you have to have something, subject, doing something. So you got to have both parts to have officially sentences in the English language, right? But we should point out that not all verbs express action, right? Instead of telling what the subject does, some verbs will tell you what the subject is or was, right? For example, the man is nice. The woman was gone. Someone pointed out that these words kind of function like equal signs. Man equals nice, woman equals gone. Right? The verb is a form of the verb to be, the basic state of being verb. Other forms include, and I know that you already know this, but I'm reviewing, are, am, was, were, will be, has been, have been, had been, will have been. Let's turn to issues, though, of verb tense. Okay? Verb tenses are actually, in many ways, some have called it a blessing in disguise because they tell you when action took place, takes place, will take place, right? And you got the basic 3 tenses, right? Past, present, and future. Let's outline them quickly, all right, for your notes. Past tense, of course, is happening in the past. John cooked the meal. Present tense, happening right now. John cooks the meal. right? The ES ending tells us it's present tense. Sometimes you need more than ending changes, like S. And that means helping verbs, right? Has, had, have, will have, are all what we call helping verbs, right? And then you got what's called future tense, right? Happening in the future. John will cook the meal. But along with these three basic tenses, we've got what we call the perfect tenses. Now, don't get lost. This has to do with Latin and the study of Latin. We call it perfect. Think of the word complete, and that will maybe help you. An action completed earlier than the time under construction. The focus is on the result. Just remember that. Don't let this confuse you. Just learn it, okay? So there are three perfect tenses that go with the three already, and let's look at it this way, right? Present tense, Joe cooks fish. Doing it right now. Past tense, Joe cooked fish. Future tense, Joe will cook fish. All that I think makes sense. But now what about present perfect? Joe has cooked fish. Past perfect, Joe had cooked fish. Future perfect, Joe will have cooked fish. Do you see or hear the state of being verbs? Hear it again. Present is the is, are, am. Past is the was, were. Future is will be. Present perfect is has been, have been. Past perfect is had been. Future perfect will have been. Now, let's go ahead and ask it out loud, because I'm sure you're probably asking it as well or thinking it. Why does any of this matter for ACT prep? Well, that's a good question. Let's answer it. Because we can have issues with verb tense that ACT loves to test, all right? For example, listen to this sentence. Quote, there was a building where the park was, end quote. Now, if you think about that, technically, this says that the building and the park are in the same spot right now, which is, of course, impossible. So corrected, really what we're saying is there was a building where the park had been, past perfect. That is to say, the building replaced the park. Let's review tenses. Most of this you already know, I know, but the review does us some good, I think. Present tense refers to actions currently in progress. Present perfect refers to actions occurring at no particular time in the past and which may still be in progress. For example, Steve is, present tense, captain of the soccer team and has held, present perfect tense, the job since last year. Then you have past tense, refers to actions completed in the past. You have past perfect tense, refers to actions completed prior to some specific time or moment in the past. By the way, note, we need this to indicate which action occurred first. For example, before Steve arrived, past tense. Before David arrived, past tense, Steve had jumped, past perfect, in the pool, right? Finally, future tense refers to actions that will occur in the future, obviously. And future perfect tense refers to actions that will be completed at some time in the future, but prior to some other action or event. For example, Joe will arrive, future, in Worland on the 16th, but by that time Paulo will have been gone, future perfect, for 3 weeks. Well, let's make some final thoughts on tense here really quickly. I mean, is this silly? Yeah, maybe, okay. But learn to appreciate the distinctions, because knowing these subtle differences helps to clarify meaning. Just listen to what I mean by a few example sentences here. Steve was in the Navy for 2 years. Suggests that Steve is no longer in the Navy, right? Steve has been in the Navy for 2 years. Suggests Steve is still in the Navy, right? Dinner had been on the table for 2 hours. Well, dinner is no longer on the table. Dinner has been on the table for 2 hours. Well, suggests that dinner is still on the table. A monument will be erected at the site of the battle where when the general returns. In other words, after the general gets back, the monument will be built. A monument will have been erected at the site of the battle when the general returns. Suggests that a monument will already have been built by the time the general gets back. Listen to this one. She has had no luck in finding her ring. Right? She is still trying to find her ring, in other words. She had no luck finding her ring. In the past, her search was unsuccessful. Whether she's still looking for the ring remains uncertain, however. How about this one? Jenny had driven a delivery truck on weekends. Well, that is to say, Jenny used to drive a truck. Jenny has been driving a delivery truck on weekends suggests that she still drives a truck, right? Let's focus now a little bit on shifting verb tenses. This is a big one on the ACT, so sit up and take notes closely. We want to watch out for inconsistencies in sentences containing more than one verb. For example, there's a shift that occurs in this sentence. Listen to it. They biked, past tense, to the top of the mountain and then come back, present tense, down in time to eat lunch. Notice the sentence begins in the past, biked, and shifts to the present, come. Right? So we've got to be consistent. Let's watch the rewrite. They biked, past tense, to the top of the mountain and then came, past tense, back down in time to eat lunch. Listen to this shift. By 4 o'clock, all the bushes had been pruned, past perfect, and the grass was, past tense, watered. Now this is subtle, and if you don't know this and you can't hear this, and you got issues, right? Let's be consistent. By 4 o'clock, all the bushes had been pruned, past perfect, and the grass had been, past perfect, watered. In other words, you want to be consistent. You can actually have two verbs. Let's point this out. You can actually have two verbs in a sentence in two different tenses. It's just that the verbs must convey the relative time that events occurred in. For example, Henry predicted, past tense, that Jenny will be accepted, future tense, by the University of Wyoming. I hope that works out for you, Jenny, right? Steve, and how about this one? Steve and Sarah had dated, past perfect, for 6 months before they told, past tense, their parents. Because Steve and Sarah dated for half a year before telling their parents, the past perfect tense is used to show the sequence of events. Let's finish with verb tenses real quickly. Use the present tense for true statements. So listen to this. Use the present tense for true statements. For example, Thanksgiving falls, present tense, on November 23rd every year. You want to use the present tense for true statements regardless of the tense of the other verbs in the sentence. For example, Joe had been taught, past perfect, that Hamlet says, present tense. To be or not to be, that is the question. In fact, and this is huge, I want you to put a star next to this one. When you report information in your writing from any source, you will always use the present tense. Okay? So if you're citing information, internal validation, external validation, or you're referencing a text while you're writing on the ACT, if they give you a passage to respond to and you're writing about it, you report that information in the present tense, even though you read it in the past tense, or even though Shakespeare wrote Hamlet in the past tense. Okay? When a sentence or clause starts with the word if, use the past perfect tense instead of would have to express the earlier of the two actions. For example, listen to this carefully. If Joe had driven, not would have driven, more slowly, he would have made the curb easily. Another example. The ceremony would have been better if Steve had been, past perfect, the speaker. Learn to adjust as well your participles according to the tense of the main verb. More on participles later, but they're verbs acting like adjectives. Okay, we'll talk about it later. Participles usually ending in ing, when they indicate an action named by the main verb, add having. Then revise the participle to the present perfect or past perfect tense. For example, listen to this original sentence, which is going to need some help. Working, there's your participle, hard on the essay, John hated to reduce the number of words. In other words, because John worked hard on the essay before he got around to revising it, the participle here needs to be changed. Let's listen to the revision and then it'll make sense. Having worked hard on the essay, John hated to reduce the number of words. Let's turn now to verb forms. All right? Verbs in the present tense regularly end in, of course, s or es, as in runs or rushes, right? Past tense verbs regularly end in d or ed, as in smoked or shouted, right? What ending to use is usually determined by who is performing the action. If the performer or performers of the action is I or we call that first person, right? We'll use one form. If the action is performed by you, second person, or he, she, or they, third person, we use a different form, another form. The form is also determined, of course, by the number, singular or plural, of the subject. Let's see some examples. First person present. I scream, singular. We scream, plural. First person past. I screamed, singular. We screamed, plural. First person present perfect, past perfect. I have, or had, screamed. That's singular. We have, had, screamed. That's plural. Let's listen to second person present. You screamed, both singular and plural, right? Second person past, you screamed, both singular and plural. Second person present perfect, past perfect. You have, you had, screamed, both singular and plural. Third person present. He, she, it screams, singular. They scream, plural. Third person past. He, she, it screamed, singular. They screamed, plural. Third person present perfect and past perfect. He, she, it has or had screamed, singular. We have or had screamed, plural. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about what we will call regular verbs, but every once in a while we get these things called irregular verbs. Let's talk about them for a moment. Most verbs will follow a regular pattern, but some verbs are what we call irregular. That is to say, they refuse to conform to the rules. They change in ways that at times defy logic. This can drive students, of course, who are learning the English language nuts, right? For example, you have the difference between sleep and slept, ride and rode, swim and swam, is and was, are and were, go and went, catch and caught, right? So for example, we don't say catched, he catched the ball. No, he caught the ball. Well, why? Oftentimes students who are learning the language will ask, why is that? These are what we call irregular verbs, right? They don't play the same game as all the other ones, okay? You as a native speaker pick this up very early on. However, some still are an issue. For example, lie and lay or lie and laid is a classic example. By the way, L-I-E or L-A-Y, to recline. L-I-E, L-A-I-D is to place something down, right? You got to make those distinctions. I would recommend right now, you turn my video off or stop listening here for a while, and you Google a list of irregular verbs. You can get this online really easily, and just review them for the present, the past, and the perfect tenses, okay? You got to know these irregular verbs because they will, I guarantee you, they will end up on the ACT, all right? For example, shrink, shrank, or shrunk for the past, and shrunk or shrunken for perfect, for past perfect tense, right? Swim, swam, swum for the perfect, right? Okay, and on and on and on it goes. The best way, honestly, to prepare for the ACT in regards to these irregular verbs is the following. First of all, study the list. Just speak out loud sentences with each word using each tense. If you hit one of these words in a sentence that you just make up that sounds strange, write that down because the chances are that's the one that's going to end up on the ACT testing you, right? Let's finish now with just some general observations about a few other things. For example, the infinitive. Let's talk about that for a second. This is the basic form of all verbs. The verb plus the word to, as in to fly, to swim, to hike. Hear it wrong, though, and it maybe will help you. To carried, to eating. Obviously, these are verbs in some other form, right? It doesn't work. Sometimes, however, the infinitive form of a verb functions as a noun. For example, to shop, that's the infinitive, is the purpose of Annie's existence. Sorry, Annie. Infinitives can also function as adjectives, adverbs, but more on that in a later lecture here, next lecture, when I talk about those. Let's talk about the subjunctive, all right? Now, it's an expression of doubt or the opposite of what is true. Technically, the subjunctive is not actually a separate verb form. It's actually what we call a mood, but it's something you definitely need to know and understand if you're going to do well in terms of the ACT prep. You need to know how it works because verbs change when sentences are cast in the subjunctive. The subjunctive is used to express a condition contrary to fact, usually in sentences beginning with if or as though. For example, if I were not was, but if I were rich, I'd buy myself a motorcycle. The sentence is contrary to fact because I'm not rich. Right? Use the subjunctive to express a wish. For example, I wish I were, not I wish I was rich enough to buy a motorcycle. Now this is big ACT stuff. You will see something like this, I'm guaranteeing you, on the test, right? Of course, it's really kind of silly because, right, either way, were or was, the sentences are still obviously clear. The subjunctive is also used to convey a sense of doubt. For example, if only the bus were, not was, uncrowded, we could find a seat. The subjunctive is used to make a recommendation, a request, a demand. For example, the lawyer insisted that her client be, not should be, released on bail. Once more, of course, let's say it out loud, this is silly business. Don't get upset about why these rules are this way. See it as an opportunity to score more points on the ACT, right? Because the only way you're going to get these points is to know these silly rules. Let's just say it that way. Does that make sense? How about another one that's a pretty big one for the ACT people? How about this? Subjects and verbs must agree. That is, they must make a match, we might say, all right? Hear it wrong, for example. The books was lost, or the book were lost. Now, of course, this is informal grammar, and we say this sometimes, but not formally, right? The rule's important not only to sentence subjects and verbs, but to all pairs of nouns and verbs, wherever they appear in a sentence, right? When the subject and verb are close, this is usually not a problem, but when a clause or a phrase gets in a way, it can be hard to see or hear it, right? For example, delivery, singular subject, of today's newspapers and magazines have been delayed. That's a plural verb, right? Notice the prepositional phrase, of today's newspapers and magazines, blurs the relationship between subject and verb. The plural noun, magazines, has misled the speaker into using the plural verb, right? Let's fix it. Delivery of today's newspapers and magazines has been delayed. Other words, phrases that can cause problems, in addition to, along with, as well as, including. What about sentences where the subject is composed of more than one noun or pronoun? Nouns